Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, June 23rd. I'm Laura Cornfield, and this is IBA News broadcasting from Jerusalem. There has been wall-to-wall condemnation of last night's lynching of 2 wounded Syrians by a mob of Druze on the Golan Heights. Israel's leaders have vowed to track down the attackers who ambushed an army ambulance transporting the Syrians to a hospital for treatment. But as IBA's Ariel Sullivan reports, the incident highlights the anxiety felt by the Druze for their brethren over the border in Syria. IBA's Ariel Sullivan brings us more.
Druze villagers in Majd al-Shams celebrating the lynching of 2 wounded Syrians. Last night, a mob of about 150 Druze ambushed an IDF ambulance near Neve Ativ on the Golan Heights. They stoned the vehicle and slightly injured 2 IDF personnel and then pulled out the 2 Syrians, casualties from the Syrian civil war, being transported to the Ziv hospital in Safed. The Druze claim the 2 were members of the Nusra Front, rebels who were fighting against the Druze in Syria. The 2 were beaten with clubs and stones and anything else the mob could get their hands on. One died of his injuries and the other was in serious condition. 2 IDF servicemen were injured trying to protect the victims. The army spokesman said the 2 victims were Syrian civilians who were being brought to Israel for treatment. It was a second such incident yesterday. Earlier on Monday, assailants attacked an IDF ambulance in the Druze village of Khorfesh. They had apparently received prior intelligence that the ambulance was transporting Syrians. The ambulance got away and hit one of the attackers. The lynching was followed by the streaming of large numbers of Israeli security forces to the Golan Heights Druze villages, and also by a massive protest by the Druze over Israel's treatment of Syrian rebels. Last night's lynching was seen as a crossing of red lines.
I think it's gonna affect the struggle of the Jews for their relatives across the border, and I think the IDF and the police must be patrol and operate in all those villages in the next few days, because we have some demonstrations and other severe incidents along the border with Israel. Will continue the humanitarian project to evacuate casualties from the battles to the Israeli hospitals. I think it's important to continue in spite of the severe incident we had here tonight.
Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu condemned the attack and vowed to bring those responsible to justice. But Defense Minister Moshe Ya'alon added that the matter was complicated and urged the loyal Israeli Druze community to calm down. Druze leaders in Israel condemned the attack and taking the law into their hands. Ayub Kara, a deputy minister from the Likud party and a Druze himself, blasted the lynching and added it could harm understandings reached with the Syrian rebels not to attack the Druze in Syria. In Damascus, Syrian state-run television praised the lynching, saying the 2 Syrians in the ambulance were terrorists fighting Bashar al-Assad. Israeli security sources said this week that there were elements in the Golan Heights reportedly linked with the Syrian intelligence who were trying to fan the flames of the issue, possibly to put an end to the relations between Israel and the Syrian rebels on the Syrian side of the Golan Heights. Israel is desperately trying to stay out of the Syrian civil war, and it appears that no matter what steps it takes, it's bound to help some and agitate others. Ariel O'Sullivan for IBA News.
Reactions have been pouring in following yesterday's release of the report from the United Nations Human Rights Council into last summer's Gaza conflict. The report accuses both Israel and Hamas of committing abuses that amount to war crimes. While the report cites serious breaches of international humanitarian and human rights laws by both sides, the probe focused more on alleged Israeli violations. Israel launched its offensive July 8th in response to heavy rocket fire into the south from Hamas and other terror groups. According to UN and Palestinian officials, hundreds of civilians were among more than 2,200 Palestinians killed during the fighting, while 73 Israeli civilians and soldiers died. The Commission's chairwoman cited the report's objectives and limitations.
You will see that we do not talk in the report about evidence. What we've collected instead, in a scrupulously objective fashion, are witness accounts, submissions, and other material that could point the way to a more thorough investigation into what happened in the summer of 2014 in Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in Israel, in order to determine whether conduct by either side violated the laws of war. The most that we can hope for out of this long and arduous process of inquiry is that we will push the ball of justice a little further down the field, particularly by calling on governments to stand up and join together to address the crying need for changes in policies regarding the use of explosive weapons with wide area effects in densely populated urban areas like Gaza, and further to hold accountable those who do not pay scrupulous attention to protecting the lives of civilians and civilian objects when waging hostilities like those that consumed Gaza in Israel last summer. First, in 2014, the attacks on homes and families, which led to large numbers of family members dying together when their homes were struck in the middle of the night or as they were gathering for the iftar meal. These attacks had particular consequences for children. Approximately 551 children died last summer.
Prime Minister Netanyahu termed the report flawed and biased.
In defending itself against such attacks, Israel's military acted and acts according to the highest international standards. The report in hand was commissioned by a notoriously biased institution. It was given an obviously biased mandate. It was initially headed by a grossly biased chairperson who received money from the Palestinians and was forced to resign. The United Nations Human Rights Council has a singular obsession with Israel. It has passed more resolutions against Israel than against Syria, North Korea, and Iran combined. In fact, it's passed more resolutions against Israel than against all the countries of the world combined. So Israel treats this report as flawed and biased, and it urges all fair-minded observers to do the same.
Hamas applauded the UN report as it relates to criticism of Israel and ignored it when the finger of blame was pointed at them. A Hamas spokesman denied any wrongdoing in the Gaza conflict, saying the terror group acted to protect Palestinians. The spokesman said that the Israeli leadership needs to be brought before the International Criminal Court for its killing of innocent civilians, and that sanctions should also be implemented against Israel to punish it for all its crimes against the Palestinian people. The White House issued a rather balanced response to the UN report.
We indicated last year, in the midst of this conflict, that we support Israel's right to self-defense. And at the same time, we expressed deep concern about those civilians in Gaza that were in harm's way. And we urged all parties to do everything that they could to protect innocent civilians who were essentially caught in the crossfire of this conflict.
The Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs prepared an in-depth report on the Israeli army's adherence to international law. That report was submitted to the UN Commission, but international law expert Ambassador Alan Baker told Arutz Sheva that the UN Commission largely ignored the Israeli study.
When you started explaining the story at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs, where I'm engaged there, we prepared a very detailed legal and military and general report, which we forwarded to the UN Commission. Similarly, in the last week or so, the Foreign Ministry and the Prime Minister's Office have issued a very, very detailed report, which isn't political. It explains exactly what the considerations were that caused us to react to the rocket firing and the acts of terrorism, and the way in which we did it, and the way in which we observed the norms of international humanitarian law, and the way in which we are investigating ourselves and any possible acts that were undertaken that might have violated any of these norms. We got an acknowledgement from the chair lady of the commission that they had received it and they'd be reviewing it. And in the actual report, there's a reference to the fact that they received material from the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. I'm not sure whether they referred to it or took notice of it, because I don't see it mentioned in any of the footnotes in the report. But remember, this is a political report by a political committee established by a political organization based on a very one-sided and biased mandate that established in advance that Israel had carried out war crimes. So If anybody was expecting that the United Nations would come out with a sort of Misha Berach welcoming Israel's humanitarian activities, then obviously they're going to be mistaken. The perception that the Palestinians have tried to spread, and especially in Europe, as if one bright morning last summer the Israelis woke up and started to attack Gaza for no reason at all. This is the first thing that we have to establish, that there was very good reason for Israel to act in its self-defense in protecting its population against the rocket attacks and the tunnels and everything else. Now, in addition to that, the other important thing is to demonstrate the extent to which the Palestinians violated the humanitarian norms by firing on civilian population centers and by shielding themselves behind their own civilian population. And the third major point, of course, is the fact that Israel's army, as is Israel's society, functions in accordance with a very strict observance of the rule of law. And Israel doesn't carry out war crimes. And if Israel investigates itself and investigates all its activities, and so, if there have been any mistakes or people were wounded or killed unnecessarily, then this is something that the Israeli army is investigating and has the means to investigate.
The White House also chimed in on the controversy surrounding op-eds from former ambassador to the U.S. Michael Oren, critical of President Obama's foreign policy views, and a racist tweet by Judy Nir Moses Shalom, the media personality and wife of Vice Prime Minister and Interior Minister Silvan Shalom.
I think in the case of Ambassador Oren, I think it's pretty clear we're just talking about another politician trying to sell books. So I'm not particularly concerned about that. As it relates to the other comments, I think if there's one thing we've certainly learned from this incident, this is not the only time we've learned this, but that on Twitter you're limited to 140 characters, but it still has the capacity to be quite revealing.
17 people were arrested last night after a protest in Tel Aviv against racism and police brutality by Israelis of Ethiopian descent turned violent. The clashes started at the end of a peaceful demonstration during which hundreds of people marched through Tel Aviv to protest the decision by Attorney General Yehuda Weinstein last Sunday to close the criminal case against the police officer who was caught on tape hitting IDF soldier Damas Pakada. Weinstein accepted the recommendation of Justice Ministry investigators that the officer had acted correctly. It is unclear how last night's protest near Rabin Square turned violent. The police and protesters each blamed the other side for instigating the clashes. The melee continued until authorities managed to calm down the situation. Protest leaders said they will continue the demonstrations until they see actual results because so far nothing has changed since the protests began in April. As the June 30th deadline to strike a deal with world powers over Tehran's nuclear program draws nearer, it appears that intense and difficult days are ahead for negotiators. Iranian Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif held private talks with counterparts from Germany and France before meeting with a group of EU leaders on the sidelines of a gathering of top EU diplomats in Luxembourg, saying they discussed how to expedite the negotiations in Vienna. Foreign Minister Laurent Fabius of France, which has been one of the most cautious countries about a possible deal, said his country wanted an accord, but a robust one that limits Iran's nuclear research and production capabilities over the long term. He said France also favors an extensive regime of verification, including, if necessary, military sites and an automatic return to sanctions in case Iran violates its commitments. One analyst of the Iranian nuclear talks said the negotiations may be prolonged due to the parties' differing attitudes towards technical details, but that the main issue is that the U.S. and Iran overcome a crisis in trust coming from tough conservative forces on both sides.
Technical details are not the most important things anymore. It's much more about confidence, trust among the negotiating parties, especially important for both negotiating sides to convince their opposition parties at home that the agreement will really last and will be in the interest of their country.
Prime Minister Netanyahu used an American football analogy to describe the current threat from Iran reaching the threshold of gaining nuclear weapons. The remarks came during a visit from 90 members of the Pro Football Hall of Fame who signed a football that was presented to Netanyahu, along with a jersey by the owner of the Super Bowl champion New England Patriots.
You know, Iran is at the 1 yard away from the goal line. If they get nukes, the preeminent terrorist regime of our day will be armed with nuclear weapons. That's dangerous for the United States and for Israel and for the entire world. And our effort today is to make sure that we block them and push them back. That's the ultimate contest and the ultimate challenge.
Foreign Ministry Director General Dori Gold has met with his Turkish counterpart in Rome in a development seen as a renewed effort to improve relations between Jerusalem and Ankara. It was the first such meeting between high-level officials from the two countries in more than a year. The rift was brought on by several factors, including the Mavi Marmara incident when 9 Turkish citizens were killed while attacking IDF commandos intercepting the 2010 flotilla that tried to break the Gaza blockade. The meeting comes less than a month after parliamentary elections saw Turkish President Recep Erdogan's ruling party weakened, forcing them to try and form a coalition. What began as the most magical day for Mor Levy and Corinne Chayun ended in horrific scenes of blood and destruction when a chandelier crashed onto a crowd of guests celebrating their wedding last night in Yavne. The incident took place at the Adaya Wedding Hall shortly after midnight. An initial police investigation revealed that the business was running without a valid license since September. Emergency services were called to the scene after an enormous light fixture came slamming down over the active bar, killing 54-year-old Aviva Chayun from Moshav Azar and leaving over 20 people injured, mostly moderately to lightly. The victims were evacuated to Tel HaShomer Kaplan and Asaf HaRofeh hospitals, where they were mostly treated for broken bones and severe lacerations. Officials have ordered the wedding hall be closed until further notice. There's no longer a town in Spain named Camp Kill the Jew. Following a local referendum and regional government approval, the village of Casteria Mata Judios has officially changed its name back to its previous name, Casteria Mota de Judios, or Jews Hill Camp. No Jews currently live in the village, which has a population of about 50 today, but many residents have ancient Jewish roots, and the town's official shield includes the Star of David. The mayor favored the change, saying that the name was offensive and the village should honor its Jewish origins. In local money matters, the shekel was up in foreign currency trading, while shares were down in the Tel Aviv Stock Exchange. Here are the late afternoon numbers. Turning to the weather, no change expected in our beautiful summer temperatures. Here are the highs and lows for the next 24 hours at home and abroad. And that's all for this newscast. Aaron Viner will be here tomorrow with more news from Israel and abroad. Until then, I'm Laura Cornfield wishing you a great evening and shalom from Jerusalem.